Hi, I'm a 27-year-old woman, and 5 years ago, I lost my mom in a tragic car accident. It wasn't just losing her, it felt like losing a piece of myself. My dad tried his best to keep things together, but 2 years after my mom's death, he remarried. That's when Carla came into the picture. She's 45, blunt to the point of being harsh, and isn't exactly the warm, understanding type. I've tried to coexist with her, but there's always been this underlying tension, especially when it comes to my mom. Carla has a knack for minimizing my feelings. Anytime I bring up my mom, she'll roll her eyes or say something like, "You're still stuck on that?" She once told me I was dramatic for keeping photos of my mom around the house. My dad, ever the peacemaker, avoids conflict at all costs. Whenever Carla crosses a line, his go-to response is, "Just let it go. It's not worth the fight." Fast forward to last week, the anniversary of my mom's death. It's always a heavy day for me. I usually take some flowers to her grave, spend some time there, and reflect. This year, I decided to keep things simple. Just me, some lilies, her favorite, and a quiet moment to myself. I thought I could get through the day unnoticed, but Carla found out. As I was getting ready to leave, Carla walked into the kitchen, saw the flowers, and let out this exaggerated laugh. She asked if I was really going to cry at a grave again this year. Then, as if that wasn't enough, she added, "Pathetic. Grown women should have better things to do." I could feel the anger rising, but I bit my tongue. My dad, who was sitting at the table, looked up briefly but didn't say a word. I shot him a look, silently pleading for backup, but he just sighed and went back to his coffee. That was it for me. I grabbed my keys and left, slamming the door behind me. At the cemetery, I tried to focus on my mom, but Carla's words kept playing in my head. I thought about how, for years, she's dismissed my grief like it's some kind of character flaw. I thought about my dad's silence, how he never stands up for me, and how alone I feel every time this happens. By the time I got home, I'd made up my mind, no more biting my tongue. If Carla wanted to act like my grief was a joke, she needed a wake-up call. The universe, it seems, had its own plans for Carla. Just a week later, her dog, Rocky, passed away. She'd had him for 10 years, and to Carla, he wasn't just a dog, he was her baby. I came downstairs one morning to find her sitting at the dining table, red-eyed and sniffling, with a photo of Rocky in front of her. For the next few days, the house was like a memorial for Rocky. Carla put up photos, wrote these long, emotional posts on Facebook, and even lit a candle in his memory. My dad was all over it, comforting her, telling her it was okay to cry, and reassuring her that Rocky was in doggy heaven. I didn't say much. Not because I didn't care. Losing a pet is devastating, but because I couldn't shake the irony. This was the same woman who mocked me for grieving my mom, a human being. Watching her fall apart over Rocky was like watching karma unfold in real time. The breaking point came at a family dinner a few nights later. Carla was talking about how hard it was to lose Rocky, how she missed his wagging tail and the sound of his paws on the floor. Everyone was nodding sympathetically, except me. I just sat there, quietly picking at my food. Eventually, Carla turned to me. "You've been so quiet," she said. "Don't you have anything to say?" I looked up and met her eyes. "Not really," I said. "It's just interesting. When I grieve, it's pathetic, but when it's you, suddenly it's valid." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. My dad stared at his plate like it might offer him a way out of this conversation. Carla's face turned red, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. Then she pushed back her chair and left the table without another word. I didn't stick around much longer. I told my dad I needed some air and left. As I walked to my car, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, guilt, and something that almost felt like satisfaction. For the first time, I'd stood my ground. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Update 1. The morning after that dinner, I woke up to a text from my dad. It was short and to the point. "You should apologize to Carla. It wasn't right to embarrass her like that." I read it twice, trying to process the audacity. Apologize? For calling out her hypocrisy? I set the phone down and ignored it for the rest of the morning. Later that day, while scrolling through social media, Carla's face popped up on my feed. She posted a long, emotional tribute to Rocky, her dog. There were several photos of him over the years, some with captions about how he'd saved her during dark times and was her best friend. The comments were flooded with sympathy. People shared stories about their own pets and offered heartfelt condolences. I'll admit, it struck a nerve. She could pour her heart out over a dog on social media and get showered with support, but when I expressed grief for my mother, it was pathetic, inspired, or maybe annoyed. I decided to share something of my own. For the first time in years, I posted about my mom. I shared a photo of her and me from when I was a kid. It was one of my favorites. We were at the beach, and she had this big, carefree smile. In the caption, I talked about what she meant to me, how much I missed her, and how I honored her memory every year. It wasn't meant to be dramatic or attention-seeking, just honest. The response was overwhelming. Friends and family I hadn't spoken to in months reached out. Some shared their own memories of my mom, while others offered kind words of support. A cousin even called to say how much she admired me for keeping my mom's memory alive. For the first time, I felt like people really understood. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. That evening, Carla cornered me in the kitchen. She had her phone in hand and her tone was sharp. According to her, my post was a passive-aggressive attack aimed at her. She accused me of using my grief to one-up her loss and said I was trying to make her look bad. I didn't bother engaging. I just walked past her and went to my room. The next day, my dad called a family meeting. He wanted to resolve the tension, but I knew it was just another attempt to sweep things under the rug. We all sat in the living room, me on one side, Carla and my dad on the other. Carla started by saying she felt disrespected and that I'd crossed a line by bringing up the past in such a public way. I couldn't stay quiet. I reminded her of all the times she'd dismissed my grief, the cruel comments she'd made, and how she'd mocked me just last week. Carla didn't back down. She claimed it was all in jest and that I'd taken her words too personally. At that point, I couldn't hold back anymore. I told her how her behavior over the years had made me feel unwelcome in my own home, how her lack of empathy had amplified the pain of losing my mom, and how her double standards were impossible to ignore. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. My dad sat there, silent as ever, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Carla, on the other hand, looked furious. She said I was being unfair and that she'd never intentionally tried to hurt me. I pointed out that intention didn't matter when the result was the same. I felt belittled and ignored every time I tried to share something about my mom. Finally, I laid it out. Unless Carla could acknowledge her actions and make a genuine effort to change, I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I wasn't going to play happy family while she treated my grief like an inconvenience. Carla's eyes welled up with tears. She got up abruptly and left the room, slamming the door behind her. My dad just sighed and muttered something about how he wished we could all get along. I didn't bother responding. After the meeting, I packed a bag and decided to stay with a friend for a few days. I needed space. From Carla, from my dad, from the whole situation. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt necessary. That night, as I settled into my friend's guest room, I scrolled through the messages and comments on my post about my mom. Each one reminded me that I wasn't alone, and that my feelings were valid, even if Carla refused to see it. This wasn't the resolution my dad had hoped for, but it was a step I needed to take. For the first time in a long time, I was prioritizing my own well-being. And as far as I was concerned, the ball was now in Carla's court. Update 2. After leaving my dad's house, I didn't go back for weeks. I needed space, and honestly, I wasn't in a rush to deal with Carla again. I stayed with a friend during that time and focused on myself. I picked up extra shifts at work, started going for morning runs, and even booked a session with my therapist, something I hadn't done in months. The first week was quiet. Then, mutual friends of Carla started reaching out. One messaged me asking if I could be the bigger person and try to patch things up. Another sent me a long voice note about how hard Carla was taking everything. They talked about how she seemed down lately, not her usual self. I thanked them for the concern but didn't promise anything. During my therapy session, I laid everything out. The years of divisiveness, the recent arguments, and my dad's constant neutrality. My therapist listened and told me something that stuck. Boundaries aren't about punishing others, they're about protecting yourself. She suggested writing a letter to Carla, not to fix things, but to make my feelings clear and establish those boundaries. That night, I sat down with a pen and paper. I wrote about how her comments over the years had hurt me, how they'd made me feel like my grief wasn't valid. I also mentioned how her loss of Rocky could be an opportunity to understand what I'd been going through. It wasn't an attack, just honest and firm. I mailed it the next day and didn't expect much to come of it. For the next week, I kept my distance. I spent more time with friends who understood what I'd been through. We went out for coffee, had movie nights, and even visited the local animal shelter one weekend. A little ironic, considering everything, but it felt good to focus on something positive. Out of nowhere, a small envelope arrived at my friend's place. It was from Carla. Inside was a simple card addressed to my mom. It wasn't anything grand, just a short note saying she was sorry for my loss and hoped my mom's memory brought me peace. It was unexpected, to say the least. I didn't know how to feel about it, but it was the first real attempt she'd made to meet me halfway. My dad called a few days later. He told me he'd started seeing a therapist too. Apparently my letter had gotten to him, and he realized he needed to stop being so passive. He wanted to work on being more present for me and for Carla. It was a small step, but hearing that gave me a sliver of hope. A week later, my dad invited me to a small family dinner. He wanted to test the waters and see if we could all start fresh. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. It felt like progress, and I didn't want to shut the door completely. The dinner was awkward at first. Carla seemed nervous, which was a far cry from her usual confidence. She avoided eye contact for most of the evening, but halfway through, she spoke up. She admitted that she might have been insensitive in the past and said she never meant to hurt me. It wasn't a full apology, more like an acknowledgement, but it was something. I told her I appreciated her words, but that actions mattered more. Change wasn't about one conversation, it was about consistent effort. She nodded, and for the first time she asked me about my mom. She wanted to know what she was like, what her favorite hobbies were, and how she used to celebrate holidays. It caught me off guard, but I answered. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. As I left, Carla said she hoped we could keep talking. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me cautious optimism. This wasn't the end of the story, but for the first time in years, it felt like a new chapter might be starting. Update 3. After that dinner, things didn't magically get better overnight, but there was a noticeable shift. Carla started putting in effort, and it showed in small but meaningful ways. A few days later, my dad mentioned that she had joined a local support group for pet loss. He said she came back from the first meeting, looking thoughtful, not her usual self. It was clear that hearing others talk about their grief had given her a new perspective. At the next family dinner, she brought it up, sharing some of the stories she'd heard. It was subtle, but I noticed how she was starting to connect her pain over Rocky to what I had been feeling about my mom for years. She didn't outright say it, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement in her tone. For once, it felt like she understood that grief isn't something you just get over. The breakthrough came about a week later. I stopped by the house to grab a few things I'd left behind. Carla was in the living room, sorting through a box of old keepsakes she'd pulled from the attic. She called me over and handed me something wrapped in tissue paper. When I opened it, I was stunned. It was a framed photo of my mom. The picture was one I hadn't seen in years. It was from a family barbecue when I was a kid. My mom had her arm around me, laughing at something off camera. Carla explained that she'd found it tucked away in an old album and thought I might want it. I wasn't sure what to say, but I thanked her. It was such a small gesture, yet it meant so much. That day, we ended up sitting in the living room, sharing stories. She talked about Rocky and how he used to follow her everywhere, even to the bathroom. I told her about my mom's laugh and how she'd always sneak me an extra cookie when my dad wasn't looking. It was the first time we'd ever really connected on a personal level. Even my dad started changing. He seemed more present during our conversations and actually made an effort to mediate when things got tense. At one point, he suggested that Carla and I try a few joint therapy sessions to work on our relationship. I was hesitant at first, but Carla seemed open to the idea, so I agreed. In therapy, we talked about everything: her dismissive comments, my bottled-up resentment, and the ways we could move forward. It wasn't easy, but it felt productive. Carla admitted that she'd been wrong to minimize my grief and said she wanted to do better. Hearing those words, especially in that setting, felt like a turning point. As we worked on our relationship, new traditions began to take shape. Carla suggested we create a family ritual to honor lost loved ones, including pets. On her suggestion, we planted a small memory garden in the backyard, with flowers for Rocky and my mom. It felt like a step toward healing, something tangible to acknowledge our grief. Other family members started noticing the change in Carla too. At a cousin's birthday party, she pulled me aside and apologized again, this time in front of a few relatives. She admitted that she'd been insensitive in the past and said she was trying to grow. It was the first time I'd seen her take full accountability, and it meant a lot. That moment gave me the push I needed to share an update on social media. I posted about how things were improving between Carla and me, highlighting the steps we'd taken together. The responses were overwhelmingly positive. Friends and family commented on how proud they were of both of us for working things out. A few weeks later, during a small family gathering, Carla surprised me with another gesture. She asked if we could visit my mom's grave together. I was taken aback, but agreed. We went the next morning, bringing flowers and sitting quietly for a while. Carla didn't say much, but her presence spoke volumes. It was a moment of unspoken understanding, one I never thought we'd share. Over the next few months, the family dynamic shifted in ways I hadn't thought possible. Carla and I started communicating more openly, and my dad became more involved in fostering those connections. We still had our differences, but there was a sense of mutual respect that hadn't been there before. By the time the next anniversary of my mom's passing rolled around, things felt different. We spent the day as a family, visiting the memory garden, sharing stories, and even laughing at some of the funny moments we remembered about my mom and Rocky. For the first time in years, the day felt more like a celebration of their lives than a painful reminder of their absence. As I stood in the garden that evening, looking at the flowers we'd planted, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: closure. My grief hadn't disappeared, but it had found a new place in my life, one that didn't feel as heavy. Carla wasn't my mom, and she never would be, but she was trying to be a better version of herself. And for the first time, I believed we could move forward as a family. Update 4. The changes between Carla and me weren't dramatic, but they were steady. She was making an effort, and while I appreciated it, I couldn't help but stay cautious. Trust takes time, especially after years of tension. One day, Carla invited me to a pet loss support group she'd been attending. She explained how it had helped her process Rocky's death and understand grief in a way she hadn't before. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go. It felt like her thing, but she looked genuinely hopeful about sharing the experience. I agreed to attend one session with her. At the meeting, I wasn't expecting much. People shared their stories about pets they'd lost, and I mostly listened. Toward the end, Carla spoke up. She talked about Rocky and the bond they'd shared, but then she shifted the focus. She admitted to the group that losing him had opened her eyes to the way she'd treated me. She said she regretted her actions and wanted to make amends. Hearing her voice crack as she spoke, surrounded by strangers, was something I didn't expect. It was raw and genuine. Afterward, we grabbed coffee. I opened up about my mom in a way I hadn't with her before, sharing how her loss had shaped me and why her sneering had hurt so much. It was the first time we truly reflected together, and for the first time, I felt like she was listening without judgment. Later that week, Carla brought out an old cookbook she'd found while cleaning the kitchen. Inside was one of my mom's handwritten recipes, a chocolate chip cookie recipe she used to make every Christmas. Carla suggested we try making them together. I hesitated at first, but as we sifted flour and measured chocolate chips, the awkwardness started to fade. While the cookies baked, Carla casually mentioned she'd been collecting little things connected to my mom over the years. She pulled out a small box filled with notes, photos, and even a birthday card my mom had written to me when I was in high school. She hadn't mentioned it before because she wasn't sure how I'd react. I was stunned. The gesture wasn't perfect, but it felt like a genuine attempt to honor my mom's memory in her own way. A few days later, Carla and I visited my mom's grave together for the first time. It wasn't a planned outing. She simply asked if she could join me the next time I went. We brought flowers, roses for my mom, and a small bouquet for Rocky, and sat quietly for a while. Carla didn't say much, but her presence spoke volumes. It felt like a bridge had been built, one I never thought possible. The changes didn't go unnoticed. At a family gathering, my aunt pulled me aside to comment on how much Carla's attitude had shifted. She mentioned how Carla seemed softer, more understanding, and how the dynamic between us had improved. Other relatives seemed cautiously optimistic, offering quiet support as we worked on rebuilding our relationship. As the holidays approached, Carla suggested dedicating a special moment to honor my mom during our family celebration. I was hesitant at first. It felt a little forced, but the sentiment was genuine. We decided on a small candle lighting ceremony before dinner, where everyone could share a memory of someone they'd lost. It was simple, heartfelt, and surprisingly comforting. Not everything went smoothly. At one point, Carla tried to organize a grief-themed dinner, complete with personalized place cards for remembered loved ones. It felt tone-deaf, like she was trying too hard. I told her calmly why it didn't feel right, and to her credit, she listened and adjusted. Instead of making it a spectacle, we focused on the candle lighting ceremony and kept the rest of the evening relaxed. Even my dad stepped up, For years, he'd been the peacemaker, avoiding confrontation at all costs. This time, he took a more active role. He started acknowledging how his inaction had contributed to the rift between Carla and me, and he made a point to support both of us as we worked through things. The real turning point came on a chilly afternoon when Carla and I decided to bake cookies again, using my mom's recipe. As we mixed dough and swapped stories, we couldn't help but laugh at the mess we made. At one point, Carla got flour on her face and pretended to be offended when I pointed it out. It was a lighthearted moment that showed how far we'd come. By the time the cookies were cooling on the counter, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. Carla wasn't my mom, and she never would be, but she was trying to grow from her mistakes. For the first time, I didn't see her as a replacement, but as someone who could still hold a meaningful place in my life. Update 5. As the year progressed, the changes between Carla and me began to feel less like cautious steps and more like a new normal. It started with a small tradition we created together. I decided to honor my mom by planting flowers in the memory garden each year on the anniversary of her passing. Carla and my dad joined in, helping me choose the flowers and planting them side by side. It wasn't something I ever imagined doing with her, but the gesture felt meaningful. Carla began sharing her journey more openly, not just with me, but with others. At a family barbecue, she talked about what she'd learned from her grief over Rocky and how it helped her understand my perspective. She even encouraged relatives to talk about their own losses, creating an atmosphere where emotions felt safe to express. Relatives who had been skeptical of her in the past started warming up, acknowledging the effort she was making to repair our relationship. One day, Carla handed me a letter she had written. In it, she apologized for all the times she had been dismissive of my feelings and admitted she hadn't known how to handle my grief. She thanked me for giving her the chance to learn and grow and promised to continue working on being a better version of herself. It was heartfelt and honest, and it felt like a turning point. Our joint therapy sessions also evolved. What started as tense and awkward meetings became a space where we could discuss things openly. Carla admitted that she had felt insecure stepping into a family dynamic still grieving a major loss. I shared how much her initial behavior had hurt me and how her recent actions had started to mend that pain. By the end of each session, I could see the bond between us growing stronger. Carla began embracing more of a maternal role in my life, not as a replacement for my mom, but as someone supportive in her own way. She encouraged me to pursue hobbies my mom had loved, like gardening and cooking. She even helped me create a scrapbook filled with stories, photos, and mementos of my mom. It was her idea to include notes from family members who had memories of my mom, making it a shared legacy for future generations. The family noticed the shift too. At a gathering during the holidays, Carla suggested we take a moment of silence to honor those we'd lost. She included Rocky in that moment, blending her grief with ours in a way that felt unifying rather than competitive. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same team. My dad also stepped up in ways I hadn't expected. He acknowledged that his tendency to avoid conflict had hurt both Carla and me. He became more involved in our conversations and started showing more emotional presence. It was a side of him I hadn't seen in years, and it made a huge difference. As Carla and I grew closer, I decided to share our story online. I posted about our struggles, the progress we'd made, and the lessons we'd both learned about grief and empathy. The response was overwhelming. People shared similar experiences, offered encouragement, and even reached out for advice. It felt like turning our pain into something meaningful for others. Carla took it a step further by posting her own acknowledgement on social media. She shared her regrets about how she had handled things in the past and highlighted what she'd learned through our journey. Seeing her take responsibility so publicly made me realize just how far she had come. Together, we got involved in a local grief support initiative, helping others navigate their losses. Carla used her experience to connect with people who had lost pets, while I focused on those grieving loved ones. It became a way for us to channel our pain into something positive, and it brought us closer as a family. The next anniversary of my mom's passing was completely different from the ones before. We gathered in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and the scrapbook we'd made. My dad shared a story about how my mom used to hum while cooking, something I hadn't heard before. Carla talked about how she admired my mom's strength and how much she wished she could have met her. As I stood there, surrounded by the people who had once felt like strangers in my grief, I found myself smiling through the tears. It wasn't that the pain was gone, it never would be, but it felt lighter, more manageable. For the first time, I felt like my grief had a place, not just in my heart, but in my family's story. Looking back, I'm grateful for the growth we've all experienced. Carla isn't perfect, and neither am I, but we've both learned the power of empathy and second chances. What started as a strained relationship has become something I never thought possible, a partnership built on understanding and mutual respect. This journey has taught me that healing isn't linear, but it is possible. And sometimes, the people you least expect can become the ones who help you find closure.